Overnight, Russia inflicted the first casualties on a NATO ally since the invasion of Ukraine began, even though NATO is not an active participant in the conflict. But this is just the latest in a series of incidents that have not quite penetrated the mainstream media's landscape, given the limited bandwidth that they are operating under these days. Nonetheless, the bigger story is full of intrigue. Ukrainian drones attacking Baltic countries, and yes, I said that correctly, a prime minister resigning, and a general lack of understanding from the public about where the real risk to NATO is. So today, join me as I first explain what happened with the bombing of a Romanian apartment building, then put that in the context of what else has been happening in our drone-infested world, before finishing with a discussion of the best countermeasures that NATO has available to it. But let's begin with what actually happened. Friday was a day that ends in the letter Y, which meant that Ukraine was the subject of another Russian drone bombardment. This time, one of the targets was the far southwest point of the country. Russian drones are not exactly known for their precision, and Ukraine jams them to make the problem worse. Sometimes, though, that leads to unintended consequences, and that is exactly what we got here. At about 1:54 a.m., Romanian radars watched a drone enter the country, having crossed the border over a Ukrainian town. The drone struck the 10th floor of an apartment building, only about 16 kilometers into Romanian territory. 2 people were hurt in the explosion, but there were no fatalities. As we will discuss in a moment, Romania has the proven capacity to intercept these kinds of drones, and indeed, it had scrambled a couple of F-16s and a helicopter for that purpose. However, consistent with long-standing policies, the call was made to not destroy them. Assuming a straight trajectory, there was only about a 5-minute window between when the drone crossed the border and when it reached the apartment complex. There is not much open space to destroy the drone without risking casualties from debris. Moreover, sometimes Russia's drones turn around and return to being Ukraine's problem, hence the wait-and-see approach. The only problem here is that there has been a lot of waiting and seeing when it comes to these types of incidents. At this point, it is hard to keep track of the entire history, but let me give you a high-level summary. For Romania, this was the 28th drone incursion since the start of the invasion, but Romania is hardly alone. The first parallel that might come to mind is the set of September 2025 drone incursions into Poland, which resulted in NATO triggering Article 4 consultations, and ultimately the implementation of Operation Eastern Sentry, which is NATO's current system to handle airspace violations related to the war. Only 10 days ago, there was another drone incident, and this one was arguably the most NATO thing that has ever happened. A drone crossed over from Russian airspace into Estonia. And if you said that the most natural response to that would be Romanian F-16s flying out of Lithuania to intercept them, then congratulations! You have spent way too much time thinking about collective security. But that is exactly what happened, and it was successful, and it was done at a relatively cheap cost despite the persistent myth that all the West does is fire Patriots at drones. On one hand, the incident proves that NATO has the interception capacity that it needs. The key difference was that the drone was over an uninhabited area of Estonia, giving the Romanian pilots an opportunity to safely dispatch it, a luxury not afforded to the Romanian pilots over Romania. On the other hand, I buried the lead. The most interesting aspect of that story is that it was not a Russian drone. It was a Ukrainian drone. It appears that Russia is trying to jam Ukrainian drones and intentionally divert them into NATO airspace, ostensibly to drive a wedge between Ukraine and the alliance. Well, all it has done so far is cause political problems for leaders not taking firm enough defensive stances. Latvia's prime minister resigned on May 14th due to a scandal from 1 week earlier. 3 Ukrainian drones crossed into Latvia. However, Latvian radars did not pick them up in time, and residents only received emergency alerts an hour after one of them crashed into an oil storage facility. Hence, Latvia is currently looking for a new prime minister. And if I may go on a brief tangent here, it is possible that you missed out on this entire affair. It has been incredibly underreported, especially on my side of the Atlantic. This is what happens when the media chooses to cover every meaningless word that Trump says, even though we should spend 2 seconds tapping the sign and move on with our lives. I still find it fascinating how it is commonplace for people to describe Trump as astrategic and irrational, yet the world collectively responds to someone with an unparalleled desire to be the center of attention by consistently making him the center of attention. Anyway, what makes the current situation unique is that it is the first time that Russian drones have caused casualties in a NATO country. I had to be cautious with my wording there, because you may recall that 2 people died in Poland in November 2022, but that was from Ukrainian interceptors that had gone off course and hit a Polish farm. This time, though, it is indeed Russia that is directly responsible for the incident, and that leads to the next question. So, how will Romania, and NATO collectively, respond to the situation? I'm going to go back and forth a bit here, because the public perception of what is happening does not match the reality of NATO's actions, and there is also a gap in understanding what the real strategic concern is here. Let me start with my criticism. Europe is too focused on outcome and not process. Something like what happened in Romania was bound to happen eventually. You cannot just have drones flying into countries and not expect someone to get hurt sooner or later. Every time there is an airspace violation, and everything turns out okay, is just another spin of the roulette wheel that luckily lands on your number. Again, the real focus needs to be on process, not outcome. And the process is stopping all of those drones much earlier. The situation up north is difficult because there are inherent limitations on what NATO can do up there. No one in Europe is about to tell Ukraine to stop trying to bomb Russia's oil infrastructure. Well, okay. Almost no one in Europe, and one less than a couple of months ago. And at some level, we need to take a step back and appreciate the cleverness of Russia trying to create a political mess by having Ukrainian weapons damage NATO targets. Point is, until the Kremlin starts letting NATO set up defensive positions inside of Russia, everything needs to be done on the western side of the border. The solution is Eastern Sentry, and the solution is working given the limitations up there. Heading to Poland and Romania is a different story, however. Both of those countries have more space to play with, because they both have Ukraine as a buffer. Russian drones should never reach anywhere close to the Polish or Romanian borders, because Russian drones should be destroyed much further east, well within Ukraine. Now, from there, you have 2 options. You could do that yourself, or you could have Ukraine do it on your behalf. There was a time when NATO countries taking matters into their own hands might have been a reasonable choice, but I think we have passed that. As it stands now, Ukraine appears to have excess interceptor manufacturing capacity. What it lacks is the set of resources to fully exploit that capacity. Europe could be doing more to front capital to Ukraine explicitly for that purpose, to create a better drone net, particularly in the western half of the country. Ukraine should not have a difficult time staffing those units, because they are relatively attractive military positions. They are far from the front lines, and the risk of death is very low. Eastern Sentry should still operate on the southern end of NATO's eastern flank, but it should not need to be as active as it currently is. Ukraine can do it. It would be an effective measure, and it would be very low on the escalation ladder with Russia. Speaking of escalation ladders, the early reaction that I have seen online is that NATO is not doing enough. European countries individually are not doing enough, and a line needs to be drawn in the sand now, lest Russia keep exploiting the West. If you have not seen a call for Article 5's invocation today, you will soon enough. Let's set aside that Article 5 was never meant for an incident like this, one without clear intent behind it. Let's also set aside that Article 4 consultations might not happen specifically in response to Romania. It is possible that they would be effectively redundant given that they already happened last year, which is how Eastern Sentry got set up. NATO views the heavy-handed approach as the wrong one. Yes, I know that European leaders have a reputation for issuing a lot of political criticism without the force to give meaning to those words, but this is one time where it makes sense. Had this whole Romania thing not happened overnight, what would have been today's video was an exploration of the preparations that NATO is making to defend against a true Russian incursion. That will now be tomorrow's edition of the Geopolitics Helpline, assuming that we do not have another political crisis in the next 24 hours. Regardless, echoing a recurring theme from my videos, one of the key points that I was going to make was that Putin is struggling to marshal sufficient forces to keep the war going in Ukraine, never mind stage an invasion of a Baltic country. The best and perhaps only solution for the Kremlin is to convince the broader Russian public that NATO is a threat to their everyday lives. I do not want to suggest that Russia intentionally struck Romania. Although that is possible, the far more likely scenario is that Russia cannot program its drones to exclusively hit Ukrainian targets, and it lacks the incentive to work hard to change that. But the last thing that anyone wants in Brussels is for the West to overreact to the situation and hand Putin a completely avoidable rally-round-the-flag effect. So, instead, aside from Article 5, and aside from Article 4, you can bet that NATO officials headed downstairs today to have a big conversation about how to respond. Because that is HQ's primary task, to politically coordinate the Allies on military affairs. And here, the political coordination is about not falling for a trap that the Kremlin might not have even intended to set. Is the current situation ideal for the West? No, absolutely not. However, we live in a world of strategic constraints, and sometimes we do not get to choose the exact situation we find ourselves in. The good news for Europe is that the situation is manageable, and it is being, well, managed. Meanwhile, have you managed to check out my secondary channel's Geopolitics Helpline playlist? Now is an excellent time to start, because tomorrow we will go into much further depth on the West's efforts to avoid just handing the Kremlin free propaganda to spread to the rest of the Russian domestic audience. But for now, if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.